There are some things money shouldn't be able to buy. Parenthood is one of those things. For the Colson Center, I'm John Stonestreet. This is Breakpoint. Writing at the Federalist last week, Kaeley Triller Haver remembered sitting in the legislature as the state of Washington legalized commercial surrogacy. While surrogacy has long been legal in the U.S., commercial surrogacy has not. In fact, it's banned in most countries because of the potential for human exploitation. Haver was struck by the lack of safeguards in the legislation. No background checks for would-be parents, no limits on the number of children they could order, no minimum compensation for surrogate mothers, no barriers against pedophiles or human traffickers who might exploit the kids created. Incredibly, in fact, the rights of the children themselves weren't even a part of that 2018 discussion. Well, this month, New York is following suit, considering two similar bills that would legalize commercial surrogacy in that state. Like in Washington, the push in New York is being made with heartstring rhetoric and celebrity endorsement, Haver writes, but again, with almost no restrictions to prevent opening floodgates for the exploitation and commodification of women's bodies or the buying and selling of humans. An untold part of this whole story, by the way, is that among those pushing hardest for commercial surrogacy are gay couples. According to an informal study commissioned by the Chicago Tribune in 2016, 10 to 20% of donor eggs infertility clinics went to gay men ordering babies through surrogacy. The overall number that represents was at the time skyrocketing, having increased by 50% in just 5 years. Now, keep in mind that if 10 to 20% sounds like a low number, self-identified gay people make up only about 3% of the population. By the way, the sponsors of both bills currently before the New York State Assembly, just like the sponsor of the bill that became law in Washington State, are openly gay. In New York, LGBT activists are mostly rooting for the less restrictive of the two bills on the table, insisting that any safeguards on commercial baby making would, quote, unfairly harm LGBTQ families. The safeguards that these activists oppose are the same as those that are applied to adoptive families, home studies, waiting periods, protections for birth mothers. According to a joint letter by several LGBT rights groups, such evaluations would be unthinkable for parents who plan to have children through sexual intercourse. Therefore, I suppose their logic goes, restrictions should also be unthinkable for couples unable to have procreative intercourse and who instead wish to buy someone's eggs and rent someone's womb in order to gestate a baby that they'll call their own. What we're seeing here is the logical conclusion of the ideology that brought us same-sex marriage in the first place. Gay unions were sold to the world with a slogan, love is love. Now, of course, the only way that heterosexual love is the same as homosexual love is by making any and all biological aspects of love irrelevant to the conversation in the first place. And that's just another way of saying that biological sex, in other words, that we're male and female, and procreation are both irrelevant to marriage. And now, so many of those who intentionally chose sterile unions and argued that procreation is irrelevant to those unions are now demanding children. They're demanding procreation without sex, and they're demanding it as a right. And the only way to claim a right to what is impossible, because after all, same-sex couples cannot conceive children, is through a transactional workaround with women whose wombs they wish to rent. In other words, the sponsors of these bills want the reproductive abilities of mothers divorced from the mothers themselves. They want the wombs, but not the women. Of course, those who suffer in this cynical economic exchange, like in each and every chapter of the sexual revolution so far, are women and children. As Haver points out, surrogate mothers, or gestational carriers as they're called, are at risk of permanent sterility or other serious health consequences from ovarian hyperstimulation. The children whose rights are not even considered will grow up, and as we've seen in other situations, they'll want to know who they are and where they came from. Many in similar situations understandably condemn how they were conceived, bought, and sold like products. The European Parliament has already denounced surrogacy as an act of violence against women, and countries like India, whose citizens stand to profit from renting their wombs to rich Westerners, have recognized the built-in exploitation in the practice and outlawed it. Yet, if activists and legislators get their way in New York, it will soon welcome commercial surrogacy. And by doing so, they'll be endorsing the idea that families, including children, are commodities to be bought and sold. But it's always the women and children, especially the most vulnerable ones, who will pay the highest price. For Breakpoint, I'm John Stonestreet.